Hello and welcome to All Things Non-Linear Dynamical, talks about the brain and human connection. This show tackles the big questions, overcoming challenges, mental well-being, the power of music and literature, and even cutting-edge brain training tech. Because, as they say, All Things Non-Linear Dynamical talks about the brain and human connection. Join Craig the Servidor and his special and amazing guests as they explore the physical and mental landscapes that make us who we are, offering practical tools and broad perspectives to help you navigate your own unique journey. It's going to get weird. It's going to get wonderful. So get ready to explore the incredible world within and buckle up this time particularly because this episode's guest is, you've worked this out now, it's me. That's right, folks. It's your favourite bearded broadcaster, the one and only Andrew Edwards. Said you know I heard about you. I'm talking to you from Leeds in the UK, a city of about 750,000 people, about 25 miles from York, and about halfway, that's 170 miles or so each way, from London and Edinburgh. We're in the fine county of Yorkshire in the north of England. And for more than 3 decades, I've been a radio legend. Craig actually wrote that bit, bringing to the ears of listeners to BBC Radio in this part of the world the news, the laughs, and even a sprinkling of gardening wisdom. Now I'm leaning into the mic to share a heartwarming story with Craig, particularly you. A celebration of the amazing woman who made it all possible, my lovely mum, Carolyn Mary Edwards, with possibly a bit of help from Ripple the Donkey. Get ready then for some laughs, perhaps some tales, but I hope more of the happy kind than the sad, and more heart-warming stories. So grab your Kleenex, however, as we say on the BBC, other brands of tissue are available, and tune in. Friday Gids yours.
Oh, that was the best ever. And I don't even owe you money, right? It's so wonderful to have you here, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Bless you. Thank you.
Bless you. You know, I'm going to tell my brief story of how we met. You know, it was late 2022, I believe. And it was a difficult time for me, you know, with COVID, deaths of family members, my very best friend. So I felt rather isolated. And your pal, someone you know, Hillary Robinson, has been a longtime Twitter X, as they call it now, friend of mine. And I you know, I'm an eavesdropper. You know, don't call me a digital stalker, but you know, if you do, I'm a loving, kind. I just think very, very highly of her. I really appreciate her. I met her through Emily McGuire, who's an independent singer-songwriter back in the UK now. She was in Australia. And I just saw the exchange between you two, and I thought, well, I got to get to know this gentleman. And so I found you on BBC Radio Leeds, and just really, you know, made to me an immediate connection. And you were so kind to me. You know, you'd even respond to my tweets at the time. What do they call them now? Posts, I don't know. And mention me on the radio. You know, here I am in Northern California, the USA, and I'm just tickled pink every time. Okay, Andrew's going to be on, you know, and I know you were on at different times, but it worked out best for me. Late night, very late night here in California. And then, you know, again, digital stalker walker here. I found your Mum and Me, the Dementia Diary. I was curious about you, and I wanted to know more about you. I felt a connection with you, and oh my goodness, that touched me so deeply, because you know, I had a similar but different experience with my lovely mom, and it just was so wonderful. I couldn't watch every episode here in the States, but I watched every episode I could, and you know, to prepare for this podcast, I revisited it, the first and the last episode, and sorry, I get emotional. But what you presented was so real and so moving and so important, in my humble opinion, for caregivers in general, as well as those people who are impacted by that terrible disease. And my mother did have Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's didn't get her. COVID got her. And but anyway, that's my story of how we met, and I'm so grateful to you, grateful to have you as I consider my friend, and grateful to have you here.
Well, it's lovely to be here, and you talk about being a friend is why I have done for, I joined the BBC 35 years ago in the July of 1989, and that intimacy with listeners is what I think makes radio or podcasting like this so powerful. And you said that you felt you found a friend, and I did as well, because I think so many people spend their life blaming social media for pushing people to extremely polarized positions. But what it allowed you and me to do is I saw this guy was popping up. You don't need to be genius to work out that for most of the year there's an 8-hour time difference between you. So, you know, I might send a message back and I got a picture of you going to bed in California as I was getting up in West Yorkshire. So if we sit here today, it's just after 7 o'clock in the morning in the UK as we're recording this, and it's late night for you in California. That's the way it works. And I have had listeners over the years who are, many of them expat listeners, who have left Yorkshire and keep in touch with home through the radio. And they may be able to listen late at night live or whenever they want recorded to the taste of home. And when you've got social media in real time, you can send a little message back. And what bigger thing, Craig, is than that buzz of hearing your name mentioned on the radio? So we were on holiday in beautiful Wales over the last couple of weeks. We have no facilities in our battered old caravan. You have somewhere to get water, and you have somewhere, without going into too much detail, to empty the loo out. And we were sitting there on a glorious evening with the radio on, listening to music, and the person on the radio said, "Tell us who you are and what you're up to," which is all I've spent 30-odd years doing, really. And we said, well, we're Kathy and Andrew, we're sitting in our old caravan in beautiful Wales, listening to your really relaxing music as the sun goes down. And then 20 minutes later, they're on a national radio station, we're having our names read out, and there's a real buzz. And that's about connection. And what you're talking about here with this wonderful podcast is about connection. I'll say at the start, I stressed it, it's about the brain and human connection. And you and I found out, and you continue to find out in different ways with the various learning and care responsibilities that you have, what it is like to look after someone and communicate with them in a way that might not necessarily be what most of us spend our lives thinking of as straightforward communication. So I've done a lot of work, for example, with people who are blind and partially sighted, who pick up on things because they're not seeing. They pick up on so much more through what they're hearing and feeling, and they get an idea of who you are, and when you're perhaps in a slightly low mood, or when something's happened, or when you're ill before you even know it yourself. And what that dementia diary enabled me to do, and it's a little bit persuading to do it. I should explain if you don't know the context. My mum, Carolyn, was diagnosed with what's called mixed dementia, so Alzheimer's and vascular dementia. We were on holiday. She was on holiday with my brother, actually, and his then much younger children in 2017, and started showing signs of things not being quite right. And we got a formal diagnosis early in 2018, and then I started from 2019. I wish it had been earlier, doing a weekly audio diary where I didn't speak with my professional hat on, as it were. I was speaking as a son who was spending at least a day a week, often 2 days a week. So I worked mainly weekends and the end of the week. So I'd spend the beginning of the week with Mum. And it meant I had a weekday when you could liaise with the various doctor or social care services or whatever it might be, or I could try and take her out for a trip to see the little world when she can still move. And I started talking each week, not long, about 3 minutes on average, about what it was like feeling that. And it was mundane stuff often, or quite funny stuff, or increasingly quite difficult stuff, to talk. I'd never really heard people talking on the radio about incontinence, but to see your own mum, I was out on a holiday with her when Mum wet herself in my car. And that is something that I thought, well, I've got to talk about this because I'm not the only person who's dealing with this. And
No,
your relationship
no,
to your parent changes, doesn't it?
exactly.
Craig? So that was the story. And I think what you very kindly picked up on, the first one, which was probably a bit rubbish and mundane, there were actually earlier ones than that, which aren't online, which I hope I've actually put up on my own website. But the last one, I thought, I've started this journey. I'm going to finish this journey. And
Yes.
2 years ago, in July 2022, Mum died. And I
Right.
didn't know she was going to die. It came very quickly. There was a heat
Mhm.
wave, and the heat really punished her. And I
Yeah.
thought, you know what? I've got to do this. And it was a rather longer one than 3 minutes. But I sat in the room where the people from the funeral service had been to collect Mum's body. I sat next to her
Mhm.
bed, and I recorded the final Dementia diary, because I think I owed her that, and I think I
Right.
owed our listeners that most particularly,
Right.
because they'd taken me to their trust on that journey.
And what I found so wonderful was that her wish was granted to be in her own home, in her own bed with her two sons. And, I'm sorry, I get emotional, but very touching, very moving. It was obviously a tremendously difficult thing for you to experience, but at the same time, if I may, I think it was a healing experience, to let her go in the way that honored her, that her final wish being granted, just amazing. And I was so appreciative of you sharing that. I had a similar experience with my mom. And this is more about you, but I just wanted to interject. She had dementia. She had Alzheimer's, dementia. She had macular degeneration, diabetes, undiagnosed until her 80s, bipolar disorder. And I got to spend some time with her until lockdown in March of 2020. Didn't get to see her. She was in a nursing home until the day of her passing. Unfortunately, I was able to be there with her. And, all gloved and suited and face mask and whatnot. Interesting story is, I won't go into great detail of it, but my brother had passed. He was in Australia, and he had written a book. And he had always told me before he passed that maybe someday I get it published. Now, I didn't know Mother was going to die. But I found out, I guess 6 or 7 days before she passed, that my brother had passed. That's another story for another time, perhaps. But he had given me copies of his book and asked me to, help him review it, edit it. And I had it. And I found out he passed. And I thought, well, I got to publish this. And so I got it published on Lulu. Not trying to give a plug, but that's where I got it published. And Andrew, the morning that my mother passed, it came in the post. And so I got the call from the doctors that, we got to take her off of life support and she's going to pass. And I'm so grateful they gave me the opportunity to come. So I grabbed that book and I brought it to her all gloved up and I read it to her. Excuse me. And within 15 minutes after I finished reading it, and my brother was a unique individual and undiagnosed with they no longer call it Asperger's. They keep it under the autism spectrum, but he was definitely an Aspie, and it was a hard read. Okay. But I read it to her and let her know that he was there with her as well as me. And within 15 minutes, she passed. And I left the book with her. It was a little, not a paperback, but a bound paper book. And I asked them to make sure that this was brought to the funeral home. She wanted to be cremated. And, I put it under her hands and, I couldn't kiss her because, I was all suited up, but I felt like I did her justice and honor and gave her the respect and dignity that she needed. so many people, the staff told me so many people wouldn't come, and I'm like, I had to be there. That was my mom. And I didn't want her to pass without me. So anyway, I'm sorry, I took up a little
No,
bit
that
of
is
time,
so
but
powerful. Okay, I think that thing of you and your brother being there, and we lost my partner Kathy lost both her parents to COVID. Her father was in a care home. Her mother came here. She lost to die at the height of the
yeah.
pandemic. I was, in that sense, very lucky. Now, the rules here with COVID. And Mum didn't get COVID. I took her for her first injection and she had her second here. I wanted to go home, but it's a bit hard across, the Atlantic Ocean here and the whole of the landmass of the United States, but I wish I could. The rules here were that if you had caring responsibilities, you were allowed to link to that person and you didn't need to wear you could go into their house and you had to be careful. So I wore a mask with Mum because I didn't know if I would be infected. But it meant I could carry on doing all the other things because the care workers who looked after Mum, they didn't miss a single visit during the whole of the pandemic. They were fantastic. But she wouldn't have got the food into the house. She wouldn't have had the house cleaned, all of those things. So I was in a unique position in many ways that my job, talking on the radio, was seen as public service. I still used to go in all the time, didn't miss any programs through the pandemic. And I also used to drive 60 miles to the Easter Hull, where I come from, where my mum lived, to look after her. And that was an enormous privilege because, of course, I didn't know at the start of this journey, none of us had even heard of COVID, had we, when the pandemic and coronavirus, it was new to us all. And you mentioned about Mum's favourite wish. I grew up, as was very common for in the era I'm from. So I was born in the 60s, and I grew up with one grandparent because all the others had gone by the time I arrived. And it was survival of the fittest. But my grandpa was very special to me, and grandpa was Mum's father, and he died at the age of 95. And he was a very, very big part of my life. I arrived the year he retired, and he died when I was 30. And so he took me on as a little project. But at the end of his life, he was very independent. He lived in a little bungalow. He had to go into a care home. And my mum was heartbroken that he had to do that. So she always used to say, my dearest wish is to stay at home. And with dementia, you don't get to choose this, how this plays out. If mum had a period where she wandered and I got a call, 12:30 and another one at 1:15 in the morning, to say she'd been found out on the street waiting outside a shop that wasn't going to open for hours. And if that sort of behaviour had happened, and I know people who become violent with dementia and they can't live safely by themselves, but Mum, she was safe, and she lost the ability to self-mobilise, as a lot of people in the care professions and health professions call it. So a couple of carers, and this was one of the differences in me, and until the end, I, by myself, could get her up out of her chair. I had all these chairs which is all wired up, and it's like an ejector seat in a jet, and she would push her up. And Mum, but unless Mum had that encouragement, she didn't leave her seat. So that meant she was safe in her home. And even though by the end she had to be winched everywhere, and she had a hospital bed, which is the one she died in, she stayed in her home. And as you say, starting to be emotional now as well. She died in July 2, a very, very hot weekend. And in fact, I've been at a wedding. The half, my daughter was in the States, funnily enough, working. And it was one of her school friends. But we'd known the family for a long time. We were at this lovely wedding. And it was in a rural part of Yorkshire. I came back to the car because I was working on air the following morning and needed to get home. And I feel bing, 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 bing. And it was all messages saying, we're not happy about your mum, it's a bit hot, this, that, and the other. And I gave a few ideas of what we could do, and then it just didn't feel right. So after my breakfast program on the Sunday morning, which you regularly listen to, I decided I need to go over to Hull. And I was, in fact, due to be on holiday. So that career very quickly wasn't going to happen. I rang my brother immediately once I'd got there and assessed the situation. And you don't know. I didn't know whether Mum would pull through. She'd been remarkable. She'd been like Houdini. She escaped from loads of situations where the doctors thought she wouldn't get through. But this one she didn't get through. And I think it was the heat, and the dementia was just eroding her. And we were there for the whole of the Sunday, and then I've seen with so many people, if you sit by them, they hang on. And I said to my brother, I said, I don't know how long this is going to be, but we both had an instinct that this didn't look good. And we both went to bed, and we shared a bedroom in our parents' house for the first time since we were teenage boys. And and the reason is because there was so much chunk in what had been my brother's bedroom in the family house, because I had to, Mum was in what had been a dining room, which was now like a hospital room. So all the stuff I'd moved around the house was piled up. But I used to, of course, regularly sleep in what had been my bedroom, and I had kept another single bed in there where my daughter, if she came to help me, would be. And so my brother and I shared a room, and we went down early on that July morning. Mum had slipped away. So we were with her in that sense. We're in the house. She was still cuddling Ripple the donkey. And that was the end of the story. And but you're so right that being able to honor what she wanted. I didn't know how to be able to. I tried my very hardest.
You're right.
People are very good at telling you what you ought to do, I found with this. They said, well, why haven't you sent your mother to a home? And you realise that so often people are talking about their own anxieties and worries through you. But I found that overwhelmingly people were generous when I told my story, because it was a unique story, and it was Mum's story. I called it Mum and Me, the Dementia Diary. But by the time I started it, I realised that I was communicating with Mum hugely, and this is why I'm so interested by this, is about the brain and human connection. My boss, my editor at the radio station, said, we need to hear Mum's voice, Andrew. And I said, right, well, I get that. I hadn't realised we didn't really. I'll try and record it. And I realised by the time I tried to record it, Mum was not saying anything more than yes or no, or whatever. So our communication was like you and me. You can pick up, I can see you're emotional, I can see you're laughing, or I can see you're tired, or whatever. And if I said to Mum, do you want chicken soup or tomato soup? Well, that's face, she couldn't really chew anything. She, quite late, could still think, well, I fancy tomato soup today. And so she could indicate things. And I could take her out until the last year or more in the car. I kept her old car. She was familiar with it. And then, because her memory wasn't there, and she had a vague familiarity that she knew this chap sitting next to her son. And then she'd be like at the cinema in the car, she would see almost like a living film of things that were familiar. So I would deliberately take her to the village where she moved in 1943 with her family. And so you could see that she would see a lamb in a field, or she'd see blue sky, and that would give her pleasure. And we were communicating, I realised, but it was very little with words. I was speaking, of course, I talk endlessly, but she was communicating in her own way. And that for me was such a lesson in the fact that people say, did Mum know who you were? And for the last year plus, I have no idea. She didn't say my name. But I think that she knew that my brother and I were there. And I think that is why when we went off, I said, I think Mum would like to be left. That's why I think we gave her to permission in a way to slip away. And I was not surprised that when we came down, she'd gone. And it was it feels like it sounds an absurd thing to say in many ways, but we're so busy often in our lives on careers or outward show or whatever, but actually that feels to me like the most important thing I've ever done in my life. It was certainly a profound thing, looking after Mum, trying to be true to her as myself, but using the it's a luxurious position in a way. I said to persuading to do this diary, I was of a generation where I wasn't the news, I was the bringer of the news. I would ask other people their opinion on the news or whatever. But to be more personal like this was something that pushed me out of my comfort zone, but I'm so glad I did. That's why I said I should start it earlier. But it meant that I used the power that I have through my job and the airwaves and the fact that you can still get BBC sounds, except a few of the editions of You Said don't have permission to be listened to around the world. That is something I didn't quite twig at the time. I might be able to sort it out, but it meant that story carries on being of use to people. And I was honoured with an award from the Alzheimer Society, who are one of the big national charities in the dementia field here, with something called the Dementia Hero Award, which was actually presented in a virtual ceremony during lockdown for what the diary did in increasing awareness and understanding of dementia. And that, in a way, that award was for Mum and for me, as the diary was for Mum and for me and for everyone else who picked up and listened to it, whether they got connections to dementia, past, present, future, or whether they just thought, this is a window into something I thankfully am not.
Well, and one of the things, there's so much that I remember, in listening to this, but how wonderful your mom was. If I were in the UK, where you're at, I would imagine that I would be one of those people that would come by to be fed by Mom. Right?
She was in catering, Craig. So she was in catering. So she knew a thing about putting a meal on the table.
I know. An amazing woman who loved tulips, right? Fancy those tulips. And just
you mentioned
her story. Her story got to me. Okay,
I can see that.
You presented it so beautifully, and it touched me so much that I feel like I knew her. As I'm watching this, and that lovely smile that she had, and that picture of you and her, just very, very wonderful to me. And I'm just a lay person over here, but boy, it's so brilliant, Andrew, what you did, and such a touching and moving story.
Well, I'm a lay person, Craig. I'm a lay person. That I as I said, this wasn't me with my broadcasting training experience. This was just me. I didn't use a microphone. I just, to be really, I got my phone here, and at the end of, when Mum was still aware of what I was listening to, I got a little microphone shield that I put on there so that you get all horrible popping sound. So I literally, when Mum was still aware, I used to record it in the car. So I'd sit outside the house and record it. I felt a bit funny, so normally she had a little drive, but normally I'd go round the corner and park and do it there. Or sometimes it would be in the house. And so I'd just record it on an ordinary smartphone.
It's so funny that you say that, because I would record my mom on my phone.
Well, there we are.
And upload it to YouTube, and try to. I have a wonderful 22 or so minute interview of her, telling her life story.
Wow!
And I was, I have those memories, and I have a voicemail from her on my phone. I will not delete it. That I go and I listen to every once in a while, and I get to hear the voice of my mom. It's not.
I wish I'd been as smart as you, Craig, and recorded her when she was lucid, because my dad was a man of very few words, and he died in 2015, and Mum had looked after him, and he, like you all, he had diabetes, he had macular degeneration, he had a whole backload of medical issues. Ironically, lived to be an older age than my mum, and she kept him on track. It was almost a lot of the medical professionals I've come across talked about this. A lot of people, dementia doesn't show while they're holding it together for somebody else, and then that person goes, and then everything starts to show, and you particularly don't notice it in a home environment. So that was probably why my brother and his wife and children had taken Mum on holiday after Dad's death, and she was out of her environment, and she was getting older, and they'd got a little scooter thing for her to go up hills. That's when they began to think, this doesn't add up, and it is really interesting how that all plays out.
Yeah, it is. And I get, that makes sense to me, that they keep it together to take care of a loved one. It just makes sense to me. I don't know the whole mechanism of it biologically or whatever, but I know that as a caregiver myself, and as well, as you give of yourself in a way that you didn't think you had the ability to, out of love. And
you have to do it. I think that's the other thing, Craig. Out of love, yes, but I think also, you must have had support from very special people, and one of them is an occupational therapist called Caroline. I'll just explain what her role was. So when Mum was formally diagnosed with dementia, in the UK, you get a mix of people medical, yes, but also sort of social care people get involved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this woman, Caroline, was sent completely randomly. I didn't know her before, of course. She was allocated to assess mum's safety. So was she safe to stay in her home at that point?
Mm-hmm.
So I realised there's a well-known food chain in the UK, supermarket chain. This was the shop that mum was outside at 1:15 in the morning, not thinking it would open until 6 the following morning. But anyway, it's called the Co-op, as in cooperative. And and the Co-op must have lost an awful lot of its stock to mum, I realised, because in later life she'd go across, she'd buy bread, she'd buy milk, often stuff she didn't need, and she'd never have her money with her. And it's embarrassing as a son, that to me, this wasn't a smash and grab by somebody with a sawed-off shotgun. This was an old lady who had dementia and who does not remember that she not got her money off, that she'd bought bread 10 minutes ago or whatever. And this lady Caroline said to me, look, your mum's fine. She doesn't walk out into the middle of the road. She hasn't forgotten that when you come to a road, you look to see if there's anything, you go to a crossing and someone lets you across. And then the first time I had to help mum at the toilet or take a urine sample to give to the doctor, or Kate mentioned already with her having an accident and wetting her pants in my car without any spare pants with us, because that hadn't happened before.
Right.
Caroline said to me, you know what, Amber, you're going to have to get over yourself. And that phrase is very good, because it meant, look, come on, I'm her son, and I treat her with respect and all that. It doesn't mean I need to stop treating her with respect, but that barrier has shifted. I'm now the carer, and she's the person who needs the care. And people say that it is like second childhood, that you're becoming the baby again in some ways, and the woman who brought me into the world was now the person I was going to see out of the world. Right. And I think when I began to get over myself and realise that the toilet was blocked, I remember work on Friday afternoon, without going into too much detail, there was an overflow, and I couldn't get a plumber at that notice. It's 60 miles away. I had to say to my boss, you know what, this is a very unpleasant situation. It needs sorting out. I can't get anyone else to do it. So who's going to go and block the toilet? It's me. And that's not what when you look at your great life plan, you don't think on a working day, going into the boss and say, you know what, I'm going to have to drive 60 miles to unblock a toilet, by hand. That's not the blower side of it. I don't know if I do like to say it like that. I think I did talk about it, but not in too much detail. But I think that illustrates it. Yes, you do it because you love the person you care, but you also do it because you've got to do it.
Yeah, you got to. I'll tell you a funny story. Now, this was involving my father, who also had dementia. And, late in life, he was in the military, and I'm sure he picked up, he was in what they call a logistics person. And so working, around engines and fuel and so on and so forth. So, later in life, he had all kinds of problems. So one of the it's funny now. It was mortifying as it happened that he had to go to the bathroom, and there wasn't a public bathroom, but there was a bank, and they did not offer public service. So I had to wheel him in and beg to be able to use their bathroom. We go into the bathroom, and it's this magnificent, glorious looking, like rich, gold plated and everything. And I help him get in the stall, and oh my goodness, everything was all over the place. And I'm mortified, right? Because I'm trying to clean him up. I do not have anything to put on him, and I'm trying to grab all the paper towels and everything. And just as I finished somewhat cleaning up, and I'm getting out there, someone's walking to go to the bathroom, and I'm like, oh dear Lord, let's get out of here as fast as we can. So yeah, I know. Yeah. And it's beautiful the way she put it. Get over yourself. This is what you got to do, and this is life. And but I can laugh at it now. I wasn't laughing.
Oh, I can laugh at it. I can laugh at it. And I think that's one of the important things, Craig. There were so many funny moments, that to give you an example, my mum, what you call fries, chips. My mum was in catering. She, believed in healthy eating, but she didn't like spending, when we were kids, giving us unhealthy deep fat fried food all the time. So
Mm-hmm.
I would
Mm-hmm.
endlessly want chips, and she wouldn't do chips. We'd have them occasionally. But she would never eat them herself. She'd never have fried fish. Now, Hull, where I come from, at one time was the biggest fishing port in Europe. So there was a lot of fish around, and there were a lot of what we call fish shops or fish and chip shops, where that was the takeaway meal. It never happened. My mum also would not eat grilled or toasted cheese. She'd barely eat cheese. And she also wouldn't eat ice cream for whatever reason. All things I love. And
Right.
suddenly with dementia, she loved all of those things.
Yeah.
And so it was almost as if some breaks have been taken off, and we had a wonderful time when a couple of years when I knew this was a one-way street. And I think one of the things you realize, people want to say nice things. People would say to me, "Oh, I do hope your mum gets better." And I would have to try and find a way. And I did this on quite often, saying, "Look, this is not a story with a happy ending. No one's found a cure for dementia. We're only in the foothills of even finding things to alleviate the effects or slow down the effects of dementia at the moment." I said, "Look, there's no happy ending, but I want to make the story and the journey as bearable and as good for Mum as it can possibly be." So taking her out, giving her pleasure was important. So we go to the seaside, we'd have ice creams. And there was one scene quite towards the end of her life and getting out where I pushed her in a wheelchair to the park at the end of the road in the summer. And I didn't think to offer her an ice cream because she'd never had an ice cream before. And her next door neighbour, who was a great help and support to me, the neighbours on both sides was with us. And suddenly Mum lunged over out of her wheelchair, really dynamic, and started licking my ice cream. And I just said, "Mum, would you like an ice cream?" And I went to get her one of her own, and she absolutely loved it. We'd go to the seaside and we'd sit there and she'd eat chips. She'd eat fish. And my brother and I took her to a fish and chip restaurant in a beautiful seaside town called Scarborough, where we used to have family holidays. And she had a particular meal, and she likes very sweet tooth, I do as well. And she said, "Oh, I fancy the sticky toffee pudding." And before we got to that stage, the menu came. She looked at it, she read it all through. She could still read then, she still expressed things well. And she looked down the list and she said, "Oh, I'm really hungry. I fancy it." She chose the fish and the chips and whatever she fancied. And my boyfriend and I started laughing. We said to her, "Well, I'm glad you've chosen that, Mum, because exactly that meal you've just eaten." So she literally, what she'd forgotten, she'd just eaten this huge meal of fish, chips and meat. So then she read the whole menu through again, chose the same thing again. And we said, "Well, no, you felt that. If you want some pudding, though, what would you go for?" And she fancied the toffee pudding. So I think lots of glorious moments. And the interaction she had with my daughter. My daughter she had a year in the States at college, but she was working at Disney in Florida on an internship in the summer that Mum died. And they were very close. And I knew that Mum wouldn't have wanted her to come back for the funeral. But in the final couple of weeks of Mum's life, I got a tablet up and showed it and called my daughter when I knew the time difference worked. And we FaceTimed, and my daughter realised that you weren't going to have a conversation, but if you just talk, if my mum could see her face and her voice and could hear what was happening. And again, I don't know that she knew who my daughter was, but I think she knew that this was someone familiar who she liked, who she cuddled when she was a day old or whatever, and they had that conversation. So I'm so glad that we're smiling and laughing remembering these stories, because there are so many, and people don't often talk about this, there are lots of joyful moments, a lot of innocence almost, that you get so much pleasure from looking after somebody, as well as the pain that comes with it as well.
Oh my goodness, yes. And I'm going to give a plug for another mentor of mine, Belle Naberstack. And when this is done, I've got the LinkedIn article, and we'll upload the content and some links that are meaningful, links to you, links and so on and so forth. But she had she's to me the maven of guided imagery, and she has a beautiful guided imagery on easing grief. Ease Grief, it's called. And one of the things that just stuck with me, that I'm at that place now, is her comment that our loved ones, those we have loved and lost, are with us always, within our hearts. and it is us who come and go.
Yeah.
And I'm out of grief. I remember my mom. I had my teary-eyed moments and whatnot, but I had such a healing journey with, and I got to be with her. And I think that was, that was the key for me, in terms of being able to honor and respect her and remember her, and the grief is gone at this point in time. It's a lovely memory. I have pictures of my mom all over my wall here, and in her wedding dress that my grandmother made, and I celebrate her. And that doesn't mean I don't, you've seen me get emotional here. Everyone's seen me get emotional. It doesn't mean that I don't have my moments of, you know, but it's just such a wonderful place to be, where I can remember and know for sure she's right here.
Yeah.
She's always here.
But she's here because you're here, Craig. That's the other thing to remember.
Yes.
That, we are our mother's sons, and I think that's really important. So Ripple here, who sits with me, and I've started giving a few talks to groups about dementia. And one of the things I had to get over, I was embarrassed at first that Mum she used to love animals, birds. The reason this is a donkey is she gave money to a donkey sanctuary. So near where I'm speaking to you in Leeds, there's a sanctuary that rescues donkeys. And so Ripple was the donkey that she sponsored. So Ripple at Christmas or Valentine's Day or on her birthday would send a little card saying, "Dear Mrs. Evans, thank you for sponsoring me," which basically, of course, helped keep that donkey. And so something like that. And when I was recording that final edition of the Dementia Diary, and I'm sitting there looking at an empty bed, and it was a hospital bed which had a device to stop because Mum didn't move. It has an inflatable mattress that moves all the time to stop a person in that situation getting sores.
Right.
And I realised it. Yeah, red sores. I realised it was still doing its wheezy noise. It was still switched on, and that's quite an upsetting thing, because you realise the bed is still moving and working to stop my mum getting bed sores, but my mum's now at a funeral home. And when you're talking about grief, I was very lucky. Unlike you, through COVID, you couldn't be with your mum, but thankfully you were with your mum at the end. So many people were not with their loved ones. My other half died by himself in a care home. We only got to see his body shortly after he died, and it was only around the corner here. Not any fault of the care home, that was where we were at with COVID. But I was lucky that I had all that very special and precious time with Mum. And I think that, and I spoke about this on the Mum Dementia Diary, that I spoke about the relief as well. Relief for me.
Yes.
And I won't lie about that. No, I spent a number of years where I had the phone with me at all the times. I had close-circuit TV cameras in Mum's bedroom, one in her sitting room. I had sensors so that I'd know if she'd left the house, because I was 60 miles away. I get a call from the carers at 1 a.m. saying your mum's alarm's gone off, so that's a false alarm. And then it said, "Can you check the cameras?" So in Leary, in the middle of the night, I'd check, and they worked in low light, and I could say, "Oh, it's all right, Mum's in bed, I can see her," or "She isn't." And then I'd have to ring the lovely neighbour again and say, "I'm so sorry, would you mind just going in and seeing how Mum is?" So, there was a measure, I won't pretend, looking after somebody who the last 6 months was very hard. Very, very hard. And the penultimate edition, I talked about going to get Mum's end-of-life medicines, which weren't needed in the end. She slipped away quite peacefully. But I didn't know it was going to be, the end-of-life could have been weeks, months, could have been another year, you don't know. But there was a measure of relief for me, and I think it's important to be honest about that, because Mum was so far from being the Mum that she had been. And it's only now, 2 years on, I'm beginning to remember the Mum who she was for the majority of her life, rather than the Mum she was at the end. And also a measure of relief for her, because she didn't know her quality of life. She didn't know who she was or where she was, really. I do think there's a lot more communication goes on than we are aware of. She could still hear. She could still see. I think she was aware of presence. I think she knew in that vague way that I was somebody significant to her, etc. She trusted certain carers, particularly So I talked about that, and I thought, well, I had so many listeners getting in touch. So you've given me permission to feel that I did okay 30 years ago when I was looking after my mum at a time when there wasn't support in the same way, and you couldn't talk about it. And people didn't discuss dementia. It was seen as and there's still some people, some sections of our communities that find it, for various reasons, may of them extremely understandable why they wouldn't talk about it, seen as something shameful. People would say they've got a bit doolally, and if you saw my mum, you'd think she'd gone a bit mad, but she wasn't mad. She had as you say, a debilitating, awful disease. And so I talked about the relief as well for her and for me at the time of her death. And that grief 2 years on, and it is 2 years to the month since she died, you don't forget them. She's still very much here. And here we're having a conversation which keeps her alive again, Craig.
Exactly.
Like it does your mum. It's so very, very special. And you always have that picture of your mum in her wedding dress. I always have a picture of my mum and dad on their wedding day. And that's very special.
It is very special. It is amazing and wonderful. And, but it's so important, I think, that we talk about this, and hopefully the, people who get a chance to see this and, it will help them in their journey, whether it's a caregiver or, someone who may, become, unfortunately, pick up Alzheimer's, dementia, This is life. And, I think my brother put it in his book in regards to, life is terminal. Right?
Death and taxes, the two inevitable thing in life.
Exactly.
Oh, look at this. Here are we, two men at a certain age with a bit of grey hair to show for it. Talking, crying, laughing, showing that emotion. And that's really important. They always say, don't they? You want to, and if you're going on an airplane, you want a pilot who's got a bit of grey hair. And I think, so I would say that's a bit of advice.
I'm with you on that one.
A few times.
I like a little bit of experience when I'm taking a flight. Thank you very much. Well, listen, we're on about 46 minutes, and I think you're the one that told me to keep it around 40 minutes or so. I've loved this. This has been just so amazing, and I hope to be able to do it again and talk more about all our all of our life journeys. And I think they're fascinating. I want to know more about your photography. That's something that I think I'd like to put a pin in, if you don't mind.
Oh, well, I love that.
Somebody who finds beauty in everyday life. I enjoy seeing your photos because it gives me an opportunity to see what you see, and the beauty of it. So, with that, like I said, we'll finish this up. Stay online with me so we can get the audio and video uploaded. And then, in a day or so, I'll have this ready to go and update the LinkedIn article primarily with the breadcrumbs and, a bit of a replay. And we can share it.
Yeah, we can. And I want to thank you, Craig, because what started as you being such a veer across the Atlantic through. You mentioned Hillary, the wonderful Hillary Robinson, who's a producer. She has done wonderful things. She's a technically accomplished author. She is a producer of network radio programs from the BBC. But above all, she's just a fantastic person. And I think the fact that through friendship and connection, we made that friendship and connection. And then now you've had me on your show when your voice through your tweets came onto my show. I think that is really lovely, and it's the circularity of life, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So bless you.
Well, I like to tell people to pat themselves on the back, and I'm going to pat myself on the back for being able to get you here.
Well, I've enjoyed
pat yourself on the back.
Oh, well, there we are. Well, from me and Ripple, thank you very much to Lee. So there we are. Getting over yourself means that I don't mind that Mum talks to Ripple, and I talk to Ripple, and we both say goodbye. And thank you for Yorkshire in the UK.
And I say hello and goodbye, Ripple. All right. Till next time, take good care. Bye-bye.